So the Republican Party had a pretty awful night last night for a number of reasons. We'll go into the specifics about some of the races. There was one silver lining potentially for the GOP, but for the most part, this was a pretty bad night for Republicans and conservatives. They lost the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, and they lost it pretty handedly. Janet Protasiewicz won by 11 percentage points. Again, my range for this race for Protasiewicz was 5 to 8. 8 being on the high end. She exceeded my best expectations for her by over 3 percentage points. So she won this race by 11 points. Dan Kelly at a pathetic 44.5%. Now, there's a number of reasons why this happened. And we're going to talk about why Republicans are doing so bad in these post-Roe elections. And I say post-Roe not because this is solely about abortion, but really that was sort of the turning point where Democrats became much more energized in elections. Republicans really couldn't keep up. And there's plenty of reasons why this happened. So we're going to talk about all of those. Of course, we're also going to talk about Chicago and a couple of the other races that happened yesterday. And later today, we might talk about the North Carolina legislature, in which you had a Democrat in the state assembly switch over to the Republican side, giving the Republicans a veto-proof majority in, I believe, both chambers now of the North Carolina legislature, effectively deadlocking Governor Roy Cooper, the Democrat. So we're going to talk about all of that in just a sec. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I guess we could say this video is sort of an autopsy of why Dan Kelly did so terribly in this race and what Republicans have been getting wrong time and time again in a lot of these elections, why they're losing, and why you have such massive discrepancies in races like this versus races like Zeldin's race in New York back in November and Youngkin's win in Virginia back in 2021, because there's a very crucial reason why they were able to succeed or outperform expectations, and Dan Kelly honestly underperformed expectations and did worse than a lot of people expected. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I knew that Janet Protasiewicz was going to win this race. I knew she would win it by a decent margin. 5 to 8 is a pretty comfortable margin. I didn't really think this race was going to be that close. Obviously, I think one of the biggest failings for the GOP here was a total collapse, not just in the rural areas, but also the WOW counties. I mean, Ozaukee County, one of the WOW counties, almost flipped to Protasiewicz. Dan Kelly only won it by 4 percentage points. We just go back to 2020, just 3 years earlier about Donald Trump won Ozaukee by 12 points. So you go from 12 points to 4 points in just a couple of years. Catastrophic. Again, there's a number of reasons why Dan Kelly did so bad. One of them was because Protasiewicz was able to define Kelly really early as sort of extreme on the issue of abortion. And that was hammered home time and time again. And the interesting thing about this race was that Republicans actually were pretty even in the fundraising towards the end, or right at the end, the last couple of weeks. But the problem was Protasiewicz and big liberal groups put in so much money early on that they were able to define their candidate early. We saw this in Pennsylvania with Fetterman and Oz. Even though Oz had the momentum in the last few months of the campaign, he was hammered so hard in the beginning that his image was permanently tainted by the voters of Pennsylvania. That's exactly what happened here in Wisconsin. Voters were repelled by Dan Kelly. The message on abortion, the message that the Protasiewicz campaign was dishing out, that Dan Kelly was basically going to lead to the deaths of thousands of women with his policies, was extremely potent. And honestly, Dan Kelly and the Republicans didn't have anything effective to counter it, and they got the money too late, and the narrative was already set that Dan Kelly was sort of this abortion extremist that was also tied to Donald Trump, and it completely doomed him in the state. And Democratic turnout, liberal turnout was incredibly high, not just in the WOW counties, as we pointed out, but all across the state. Even some rural counties that Donald Trump won by a safe margin. Grant County going to Protasiewicz by about 2 points. Donald Trump won Grant County by about 13. You go over to Dane County. Dan Kelly only gets 18% of the vote in Dane County. If you look at Donald Trump's total, at least he got 23% of the vote in Dane County. So you have a massive falling off all across the entire state. You go to places like La Crosse. Oh, this is the wrong map. You go to places like La Crosse, Protasewicz is at 64%. Biden only got 55.8, about 56% lacrosse. So there was a total collapse of Republican turnout, not just in the suburbs, but also rural areas. So it's a bit more complicated than the rural base didn't turn out, which is what you'll hear from some of the more MAGA types on the Republican side, that, only Trump can bring these sorts of voters out. That's total nonsense. That's not what happened here. There was a total collapse of GOP turnout across the board, and there was a massive gap in enthusiasm because honestly, the message that, the conservatives are going to take your rights away and you're going to die as a result is extremely potent in politics. Point blank, it doesn't matter what the issue is. When you're running on a campaign like that, you're going to galvanize your base like nothing else. And, Republicans run fear campaigns as well, but the Democrats ran a fear campaign extremely effectively. And, that's something the Republicans just couldn't compete with. Now, as I mentioned in the video yesterday, talking about my prediction, the Republican coalition is vastly different than the one that got Scott Walker elected back in 2010, 2012, and 2014. I mean, this race occurred in April, this is not election season at all. And yet Democrats were able to get over 1 million votes out. By comparison, Joe Biden got 1.6 million in the state. So there was very high turnout. Donald Trump also got 1.6 million votes. But if you take a look at the total for Dan Kelly, he's at only 800,000 votes. So again, massive turnout differential. Wisconsin really is still a 50-50 state. And yet Democrats are really able to get their voters excited, especially young voters, women voters. Republicans didn't have that enthusiasm because, quite frankly, they were playing on defense. The party that plays on offense is going to win. If you set the narrative, and as I mentioned earlier, I talked about New York and Virginia, Youngkin and Zeldin were able to define their opponents extremely early in the race. Zeldin defined his opponent, Kathy Hochul, as weak on crime, apathetic about the issue, and he hammered it nonstop 24/7. In the areas where he did very well was New York City, where crime was a potent issue. In fact, the areas where he had the least swing from 2020 in his favor was actually the Hudson Valley, which is relatively wealthy, relatively safe part of the state. That message doesn't really resonate well. Now, Dan Kelly also talked about crime, but it really didn't do him any good because, honestly, the issue of abortion was much more potent to voters than the issue of crime. And again, abortion is going to be a really tricky issue for Republicans going forward because when you have over 50 years of precedent of abortion basically being a guaranteed right protected by the Supreme Court, now that that's gone, abortion is a huge rallying cry for the Democrats. It already was before Roe, but now it is much more potent because you actually have red states passing laws that are way outside the mainstream, that are literally criminalizing people that get abortions from leaving their state. They're not allowing you to leave the state to get an abortion. Those positions are noticed by Democrats in purple states, and it's not something they want in their state. And that's what gets these voters so galvanized, especially in places like Dane County. Kelly only getting 18%. That's catastrophic. Only 27% in Milwaukee County, 58% in Waukesha, Washington 66%. Just a total collapse. Protasewicz won Green Bay by 4. She won Winnebago by 8. Total collapse of the GOP all across the state. It wasn't even an urban-rural thing. It just happened absolutely everywhere. And as I mentioned, Protasewicz was able to define Kelly really early on. Kelly struggled to raise money really until the end when he had a number of conservative group PACs sort of bail him out. But really before that, he was having a lot of trouble, and the fundraising was abysmal. Really only in the last weeks did he get more competitive, but there really weren't a lot of Dan Kelly ads on TV from what I hear from people in Wisconsin. They just didn't raise the money in time. When the money actually came in, it was too late. Everybody had their minds made up about Dan Kelly, and that's why he lost by such a catastrophic margin. Now back to what I was talking about before. Youngkin was also able to define his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, as against parents, as a puppet of the teachers union. That's why education was the number one issue in Virginia. It's because Youngkin made it that issue. He talked about how Democrats were lowering the standards in the public education system, how it was hurting students, limiting their academic achievement. Those were really potent messages, not just in Nova, but all across the entire state. The conservative base was galvanized because obviously they were sick of 8 years of Democratic rule from McAuliffe and Northam. But also you had the education issue And crime really wasn't that big of an issue, but Youngkin did talk about crime. That was sort of potent in Nova, but education was the Nova issue. And then Youngkin was able to run on cultural conservatism in the rest of Virginia, talking about how he opposed the vaccine mandates. Things like that sort of galvanized all the Republicans in Virginia, the Nova Republicans and the statewide Republicans just everywhere else. And Kelly wasn't able to find a galvanizing issue. Again, he talked about crime. No Jail Janet was sort of the name he came up with his opponent. But ultimately, it fell on deaf ears. Nobody was really listening. Again, people's minds were already made up about Kelly going into this. And, you know, it was just a catastrophic disaster. And, you know, a lot of people are saying that, oh, now Republicans don't have a chance in Wisconsin in 2024. I think that's a bit premature and very ridiculous because a lot can change in over a year and a half. But it does go to show you that the Republicans still have an institutional problem getting out their own voters, energizing their voters, and ultimately running candidates, putting forth candidates that actually have appeal not just to rural areas, but suburban areas. And of course, in this case, Kelly did bad in both. But you really need to find a Youngkin or a Zeldin type candidate that can thread the needle, that can get the conservative base energized in the rural parts of the state, but also find issues that actually affect suburbanites, because suburbanites, quite frankly, don't really care about the culture war all that much. That energizes rural Republican voters that are ultra conservative. But if you want to get suburban independents that might lean right on your side, you need to talk about the bread and butter issues that actually impact them. Youngkin did that well, and Zeldin did that well. Kelly did not do that well at all. Now, of course, this wasn't the only race that happened last night. We had the Wisconsin special election in State Senate District 8. It looks like the Republicans are going to win that. I don't know if we're going to get any more numbers out of this, but again, the Republican is up by about 1,300 votes. It looks like the Republicans are going to get their supermajority, or keep their supermajority rather, in the state legislature, which is probably the only check on the Democrats that they're going to have going forward, because the Supreme Court of Wisconsin is now liberally controlled. Obviously, you've got Tony Evers as governor, so this is probably the only check Republicans actually have in the state of Wisconsin. And of course, as I mentioned in the video yesterday and I mentioned on Twitter, gun rights, abortion, redistricting. And honestly, I failed to talk about abortion because, quite frankly, it didn't come to mind yesterday, but that actually was the main issue of this race. But I was really talking about the issues that the court impacts. Honestly, the Democrats have the winning message on abortion because when you look at the Overton window in America, Republicans on abortion, at least post-Roe, are way outside that mainstream. Now, the Republicans have been unable to construct a message that stays true to their values, but also actually appeals to the wider electorate. They've sort of been throwing red meat at the base. Again, wanting to criminalize women for getting abortions. Super, super unpopular stuff outside the Republican conservative evangelical base. And that's something Republicans have to change course on if they're going to win. Again, it doesn't mean that Republicans have to run as pro-choice, but it does mean that they're going to have to craft a message that doesn't sound extremist to the vast majority of Americans. Because right now, Republicans' position on abortion sounds extremist to your average American. And time again, in every election since Roe v. Wade was overturned, voters have said that. They said the message is too outside the mainstream. They're not going to vote for Republicans that are running hardline on abortion. We also had another major race, of course, last night, though. It was the Chicago mayoral runoff. Of course, Brandon Johnson won very narrowly. This really was a nail-biter race. As I said yesterday, this was really a coin toss. That's why I really didn't make a prediction, because I couldn't confidently say who was going to win. But when you take a look at the map here of the Wisconsin runoff elections, there is a lot of racial polarization in this map. If you take a look at this ethnicity map of Chicago and you sort of compare it to the results that we have here in the mayoral race, Johnson does incredibly well in black areas of Southside Chicago and Western. These are black majority wards. They came out heavy for Brandon Johnson. Honestly, this almost seems like a partisan race at this point when you look at some of the numbers. Johnson getting 81% of the vote, 82% of the vote in some of these black majority wards. Paul Vallis really did well in the more affluent and white areas of the city. Of course, western Chicago, which is much more suburban, the downtown sort of area, and then sort of a little bit here in the south, in the central part of the city. Now, this part in particular, I believe, is sort of Hispanic. You've got a black majority area in South Side Chicago. Of course, this area too, by Austin, this part of Chicago, black majority. But really, you see sort of the racial polarization in this map. Black voters going heavily to Johnson, white and Hispanic voters going for Paul Vallas. And really, it created sort of a 50-50 split that made this race so close. Ultimately, we don't have all the votes in yet. Only about 91% of the votes are in, so it's very likely that Brandon Johnson could increase his lead on Paul Vallas. But it is interesting to see such an ideological mayor's race in such a big city be so close, because Paul Vallas was running as the tough on crime. Again, they were both Democrats, but Paul Vallas really took that conservative, more centrist lane. Brandon Johnson sort of ran on a very unapologetically progressive lane, and ultimately you saw that divide sort of split Chicago down the middle. So anyway, guys, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.